Good afternoon and thank you for joining us. Welcome once again to TaxCalc TV. Today we are returning to the topic of HMRC inquiries. What are the enforcement teams focusing on? What are they focusing their resources on? What tactics are they using to peer more deeply into your clients' dealings? And what are the implications of some of those tactics? To do this, I am joined by two people who have spent more years at the sharp end of HMRC inquiries than most. First of all, Paul Rigney returns. Paul spent his entire life in tax, both at the revenue and in practice, before entering the fee protection game back in 2007. He's currently head of sales at Vantage Fee Protection, and so he gets up close and personal with HMRC when one of his clients wants to make a claim. On top of that, we're also joined by Davies, Managing Director and Founder of NHD Tax Solutions. Nick has decided to while away the latter years of his 40-plus year career in tax by starting a dispute resolution consultancy, and he's helped thousands of small business clients navigate their way safely through the HMRC inquiry maze. He's also an experienced litigator and spends a chunk of his time representing his clients in court. So thanks so much for joining us, gents. We know this is always a very popular topic with lots to chew over, but this session is about you and your questions. We're going to be looking at nudge letters, insolvency situations, and R&D and much more. But whatever questions or comments you would like to address, the floor is yours. To do that, you can use the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner. Only we will be able to see those questions. But if you have a comment that you would like to share with everyone, then the chat function is your friend. That's to the right of that. If you only want Nick or Paul to respond to your comment, there is a reasonable chance that we'll miss it if you put it in the chat. So let's get us started. First of all, we're going to go for a quick poll because one of the subjects that we looked at last time Paul was in the studio was around nudge letters. So we wanted to just find out a little bit about how you guys are getting on with nudge letters. So I am going to try and figure out how to post a poll with my system here. And I have to admit, Dean is not in the office, and so I'm struggling to make sure that I can do this. So if you had a nudge letter, can you see the poll on there? The question is, if your clients have received a nudge letter, what was the outcome? Was it none of my clients have received one, no amendment was required, additional tax was payable, or the return required amendment? So I'm just looking at the results of this, and although most people say that none of their clients have received one, the next most popular one, 22% said no amendment was required, 11% saying additional tax was payable, and the return required amendment is only 5%. Is that what you expected?
No, I would have thought that was probably a lot lower than I would have expected, to be honest. The revenue is spending a lot of time and resource now in generating these nudge letters, and it is one of their main focuses moving forward for actually collecting tax in the simplest, cheapest way possible. There's been lots of campaigns going out on nudge letters now already, and if that is the sort of return they're seeing, then perhaps they're going to start questioning whether there is any longevity in continuing with this campaign.
In doing that, yeah. So 21% no amendment was required there. So
I think I'm a bit surprised at that as well, because with a lot of the nudge letter campaigns that we've seen, HMRC already pretty well know that there's additional tax due because of the nature of the information that they've got. So the one I'm considering was the Just Eat nudge campaign, or the campaign that followed HMRC obtaining a huge amount of information from Just Eat. So essentially, they knew every takeaway or restaurant in the UK for a specific year, a couple of years ago, that had received income from Just Eat in that year that exceeded the VAT threshold.
Right.
So they certainly don't have the resource to open inquiries into each of those taxpayers. So what they did is they simply sent out a nudge letter because it's remarkable, actually, in my experience, and we saw a lot of these, how many takeaways seem to report a turnover of 84,000 every year. And HMRC were very well aware that, well, actually, from Just Eat alone, they'd had maybe 120,000. So they've got the question, well, why are you not registered for VAT? So, certainly on that basis, I would have expected much higher percentages of not necessarily returns that needed amending in that particular case, but certainly disclosures that needed to be made.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you for taking part in the poll, everybody. So we want to first of all just go into a recap, just a review of how things are going. Since you came in last time, Paul, what are HMRC focusing on? How are they behaving? How would you summarise that?
Revenue inquiry activity now is definitely on the increase. The political pressure around that is growing. The need to close the perceived tax gap is mounting. We've already seen Shadow Chancellor making announcements with regards to what she would plan to do if she took office potentially later this year. So that was another £500 million of investment to drive that bigger inquiry piece. It's not as simple as that, of course, because trained staff don't fall off trees. And it's all right throwing money at it, but without the additional trained staff, potentially, it's not going to yield the results that perhaps they wanted to. But we are seeing a lot of increased activity, driven through nudge letters, driven through the R&D piece, other campaigns that the revenue are driving, and challenges around reliefs seem to be quite prevalent at the moment, especially where there is a resulting repayment of tax. The revenue obviously are under instruction to repay as little tax as possible at the moment.
So how does that manifest if they're struggling with trained staff, skilled staff? Are you seeing a kind of slightly less slick operation, or is it just less of an operation?
We're seeing massive delays in dealing with inquiries. So once the initial letter has been opened, the 9A, 12A notice has arrived, once that information and response has been given, we're finding that the revenue will always say we want to reply in 30 days. You can be lucky sometimes if you see a reply from the revenue in 3 months. Right. So there is obviously that lack of resource behind the inquiry activity.
What about you, Nick?
Well, we're seeing generally poor working of inquiries, which I think is symptomatic of poorly trained staff now in place. They are making an investment, but as Paul rightly says, perhaps the investment is in bodies rather than necessarily training. So, one of the things that we've seen is an increased need to make complaints, formal Tier 1 complaints about the way in which HMRC are conducting an inquiry and the amount of time it's taking, and then ridiculous challenges coming back from them, which just demonstrates a lack of understanding of tax, quite honestly. And to add to Paul's point of taking up to 3 months to get a response from HMRC, the latest thing we've been noting is we make a formal complaint and receive a response that says they are going to be unable to respond on that complaint for a minimum of 6 months. So, yeah.
Holy moly. Yeah. A couple of quick questions here about nudge letters. So thanks, everyone. So Julia asks, is the nudge letter campaign at larger businesses or across the board?
It's absolutely across the board. One that over the last year gained an awful lot of publicity simply because it panicked everybody because of the way it was misreported in the mainstream media, was the one for people who undertake online sales. So the way that was reported, everybody who occasionally sells a few of the kids' old clothes on Vintner or Etsy or something like that believed that they were suddenly going to get HMRC banging down the door. which of course they're not. I mean, apart from anything else, if somebody's doing a little bit of that here and there to try and make ends meet during the cost of living crisis, well, there is a tax-free threshold for self-employed income anyway of £1,000 a year. That nudge campaign certainly wasn't aimed at that, but equally, it is aimed at relatively small taxpayers who are actually, doing online trading as a business. So, it's certainly not just, the larger taxpayers, the big corporations. Similarly, I guess, with the takeaways that certainly aren't large businesses, especially if they're turning over slightly less than 85,000 a year.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to bear in mind is that if you look at the revenue reports, it shows that they believe that a large proportion of the perceived tax gap sits in the SME market.
So they are going for very
Definitely
much
going
for
for the owner-managed businesses and below.
Because I know you're going to talk about this later, but how the nudge campaigns are driven and the data that goes behind them, I think that's very interesting. Paul just says he had an odd nudge letter for a client saying he hadn't declared high income child benefit tax charge, chatted with the client who confirmed none was ever received. HMRC had the wrong taxpayer. So is that an example of the...
Yeah, I mean, nudge letters and the campaigns behind it, that information is stored in Connect, and we'll talk about that a little later on. But the link to Connect to the individual taxpayer is nearly always made by national insurance number. And if that national insurance number is wrong, the wrong connection will be made. It's as simple as that, and I suspect that's what probably happened here. It was just being the wrong NI number.
Okay, so I know we're going to talk about the technology that HMRC are using later, but Kittle inquiries. This was a new one on me as an amateur in this space. Okay. Tell us about those.
Well, it's certainly not new, and essentially. This is one of the many tools that HMRC used to attack VAT fraud, specifically in supply chains. And they do seem to think it's a little bit of a magic bullet, which it's not, although it is undoubtedly very useful to them. So essentially, Kittle, it wasn't actually a UK tax case, it was a European case. But essentially, what it said and what HMRC now rely on is that if you as a business have had VAT fraud within your supply chain, and in HMRC's view, you knew or, importantly, should have known that there was VAT fraud within your supply chain, then you are potentially in an awful lot of trouble. Because apart from the fact that they can and do withdraw all of the input tax relief in respect of transactions you've had with that fraudulent supply chain. It doesn't need to be a direct supplier, it can be further down the line. You also become liable for penalties, which are sufficient to very often just take a company under overnight. And that's, I suppose, almost the good news, because the bad news is if it does take the company under, then HMRC will look to the responsible person, the director or potentially a shadow director, because they will be the person who they will say knew or should have known. Now, it's hard for them to prove that somebody actually knew, so they rely on the should have known. So they basically start crawling all over your due diligence, because they're looking to establish to a degree that would satisfy the tax tribunal that you weren't undertaking sufficient due diligence on your supply chain on an ongoing basis. They do target certain sectors for this. In recent years, they've been all over the scrap sector, especially the scrap metal sector. Currently, it's the construction industry, particularly where the construction company is using a labour provider, an umbrella, simply because VAT fraud is absolutely rife within that. Right. So we're seeing an awful lot of this. HMRC approaches on the Kittel basis can be overcome, but it's very, very difficult. So on the basis that prevention is always better than cure, always take professional advice on the quality of the due diligence that you're undertaking on your supply chain, and don't make it a one-off thing when you take on a new supplier. It has to be ongoing, it has to be routine, otherwise you're potentially storing up a whole lot of trouble.
How common are these?
Probably more common than people realise. So I mean, just within Yorkshire at the moment, I think we've got 5 Kittel cases ongoing with HMRC, all within the construction sector at the moment. So, you know, it's actually Fraud Investigation Services, that directorate of HMRC that carry out the inquiries, and they're pretty good at them, but it's certainly a target for them. You know, they're absolutely looking at the construction sector wherever an umbrella labour provider is being used, as a matter of course, you know, just to see what they can potentially do around the whole Kittel piece.
And when one is instigated, they're generally more likely than not to succeed, would you say? Or
no, I mean, every case stands or falls on its own circumstances. So, you know, if a company does undertake robust due diligence, then they should be okay. You know, the fact is a lot of these umbrella labour providers have been very, very good at structuring themselves and putting up a facade, which means that, you know, even if with reasonably strong due diligence, you're still not necessarily going to figure out what's going on. So I suppose the question is, what is adequate due diligence? HMRC do provide guidance on that on their website, but sometimes it seems to me that to satisfy HMRC, you'd actually need to have a person working full time in every company that supplies you to see what's happening on the ground day in, day out. But, you know, there's a balance. So, you know, quite a bit of what we do for clients is advising them on what is, in our view, adequate due diligence, but also routinely monitoring to make sure they're adhering to it, because this is a big values game, basically.
yeah. So well, that's insane. So Paul, in terms of those inquiries and fee protection insurance, I presume that would be covered if you did fall victim to one.
It depends on the view of that. We would certainly accept the claim, but we'd probably look to qualify it on the understanding of whether or not there was any fraudulent behaviour actually within the piece, and whether the company under inquiry actually knew what was actually happening behind the scenes. And in some cases, they obviously do. In a lot of cases, they've just turned a blind eye and not put the resource into satisfying the tests to give themselves a strong out.
Okay. So I'm just going to go. I've got a quick question to ask. And Kay, I'm not sure what challenges you're having. You're trying to post a query. Do apologise if you're unable to do that. I'm not sure what's going on. But Abu asks, how actively is HMRC chasing SME and the use of contractors and the assessment inside or outside of IR35 right now?
We don't see a lot of IR35 inquiries at the moment. It's a very difficult area for revenue. They've had some poor results in recent cases, high profile cases, and I should say that we probably see less than 50 IR35 inquiries a year coming through to our claims team. So it really isn't a massive area of attention at the moment. And a lot of IR35 cases come down to opinion at the end of the day. So there's no guaranteed easy result for HMRC around it.
Right. So they're finding the pushback is
the contract valid? You know, does the Holy Trinity actually work in this case? There's a lot of piece around it, which, you know, is opinion based rather than factual, as they've found in some of the cases they've taken through to tribunal.
One more quick question before we move on to the next segment. Kay, well done, Kay, you managed to get through. Bhupinder, if you I can see what you're writing in the question, so ask your question where you're doing it. Now, Kay says, I've been waiting for a response to a letter sent to HMRC in July 2023. Should I escalate this to my AAM?
Yeah, I mean, look, me and Nick are both ex-revenue, and I can remember back in the day that we used to get chased if a letter was over 14 days. You shouldn't have a letter on your desk that was over 14 days old and unactioned. So goodness knows how they benchmark that now. It's not uncommon. And yes, make a formal complaint. Depends what the matter's about. Some will be around inquiries. And you know what? If you haven't had the response to information provided, request that the inquiry is closed.
Right.
Make the formal request to close the inquiry because it's not being progressed.
Fair play. There you go. Hope that helps, Kate. So we're going to move on, and we're going to look next at the subject of insolvencies. Before we do that, I've got a question for you, and this is more of a test than anything else. So it's a test for me because I've got to try and figure out how to get the poll live. But the question is, which of the following are considered preferred creditors in the event of an insolvency? So there should be a list there. Can you see that in the polls? You may not be able to. It's all down to how effectively I've managed to use the system. I don't think anyone's voted yet. So, oh no, we've got people in there, so I've managed to do it. Well done, me.
Yes,
you
well don't need Dean.
Yeah, keep saying that. Keep saying that. So this is one of those. It's like a school. This is like a test question, right? Which of these is it? So if you can see the answers there, does that surprise you, Nick? We've got 27% saying VAT and PAYE, which is preferred.
I am saying that you've got a very switched on audience here, Andy.
Switched on audience.
Yeah,
well done, guys.
Yeah.
But other HMRC debt, that's not, is it?
No, that's not. No, it's really situations where HMRC are acting as a tax collector, so the amounts involved were never actually the businesses in the first place, so that's pay as you earn and VAT.
Right.
This has become a huge issue in a lot of different ways, actually. So we can all cast our minds back to, well, I should probably say the less than heady days of the COVID pandemic, and HMRC were effectively instructed politically not to pursue any taxpayer for outstanding debt. So if you wanted to make a time to pay arrangement, you could do it very, very easily indeed, because you really wouldn't get any pushback. Let's fast forward to today, and in my view, one of the worst things that's happened is HMRC regaining their second preferential creditor status. So they now stand behind secured debt in the order of who gets paid. And this means we've seen a complete about face in their behaviours. So anybody that's recently tried to negotiate what I'll say is a fairly vanilla time to pay arrangements are routinely being pushed back on that. Effectively HMRC want the money now, or they are going to bankrupt you. And unfortunately, some of the clearly untrained people that we've been dealing with have said precisely that to some of my clients. To give an example of this, I was actually yesterday morning dealing with a case which is in Scotland, so the court system is slightly different, but a bit more barbaric actually, of a case where HMRC actually without warning in this case had issued a winding up petition, which is giving the taxpayer 8 days to pay the debt in full or they're gone. And the winding up petition was for £68,000. And it didn't take a lot of scratching below the surface to see that actually what was owed by the taxpayer in total was £18,000. And this is because HMRC had misallocated payments all over the place. But more personally, the client's accountant had written 4 letters to HMRC asking for a £20,000 corporation tax overpayment to be allocated against the pay-as-you-earn arrears. Now, in this case, we've managed to evidence there's only actually £18,000 outstanding, and we can actually pay that within 10 days. So, fortunately, HMRC have withdrawn the winding up petition. But this is just one of many cases we're seeing at the moment where, HMRC are really taking a draconian approach to the collection of unpaid arrears. Simply because they stand much further forward than they previously did in terms of what they will get out of it. So certainly if they are seeing fixed assets on a balance sheet, then they become very interested in liquidating a company.
Right, so they're going full throttle on that. So has the rules changed? Have there been any changes to the way that, because I think they were about chasing down creditors and directors?
In post-insolvency events, there have been a number of recent changes in recent years. So again, one of the reasons for setting up a limited company was because of the perception of the limitation of liability on the director. That was a large piece of why somebody would incorporate. The old adage was that you're liable to the extent of your shareholding, and that's no longer the case. That limitation of liability has been attacked actually on a number of different fronts. So a lot of this, I understand why the legislation was introduced, and it was quite simply to combat the scourge of phoenixism, because there's no doubt that for a long period of time that was rife within the UK economy. You would have a company that would run up significant pay-as-you-earn and VAT arrears, and it would liquidate, and it would immediately set up again under a different name, potentially with different directors, and off it would go and do the same thing again. And there were a lot of serial offenders, and it was a huge cost to the UK economy. So it certainly needed addressing. But as ever, the legislation that HMRC has been granted to work with, in my view, they are misusing. So the first example I would suggest is the notices of requirement for security. So this is if HMRC consider that phoenixing might be taking place, and they can issue these notices even if a company hasn't liquidated, but if HMRC think there's a risk that it might, and so there could be a loss of revenue to the Exchequer. It's more commonly used when a company has, for instance, pre-packed or something like that. HMRC can issue notices which effectively require a deposit against future pay-as-you-earn and VAT liabilities, up to a year's worth. Now, given, this is very often in respect of a company that has been distressed to the point it's failed, it's pretty well impossible for the new code to raise those sorts of funds. They just can't, and it's being used in all sorts of cases where it's actually not a Phoenix operation. The insolvency was a legitimate commercial insolvency. Now, there are two particular problems with these notices of requirement. The first one I'm going to say is that, unfortunately, in our experience, there are a number of accountancy practices that simply don't understand them, because it's not a tax charge, but they are still appealable, and they need to be appealed. And the reason for that is that if a company does not comply with one of these notices, but continues to trade, it has committed a criminal offence. It's not a civil matter. So typically the notices are issued to the tax-paying company, but they will also be issued to the directors at the same time. Very often The point at which we become involved is when the director has received an invitation from Fraud Investigation Services to attend an interview under caution, simply because HMRC have issued a criminal investigation because one of these notices hasn't been complied with. The good news is they are usually relatively easy to overturn if you know what you're doing. And I've not yet had one that's had to go as far as tribunal because we do tend to get them overturned quite readily. But you know, the fact remains they're happening, possibly inappropriately in my view, because they were designed very specifically to combat phoenixism, and they're being used for other purposes.
Being overstretched. So what should someone do if they're approached about?
Well, obviously seek professional advice immediately if they receive one of these notices. Now, you know, there are cases where, in my view, it probably would be legitimate because it has been a phoenixing operation. In that case, you know, if you don't consider there are grounds for appeal, you have to stop trading immediately. You know, without further thought, stop trading, because if one of the notices becomes final because it's not been appealed, but you've not paid it, you are committing a criminal offence if you continue trading.
Right.
But as I've said, in my experience of these, which is quite a lot, they are generally very appealable. So all is certainly not lost, but absolutely make sure that you take the correct professional advice on it. Okay.
And yeah, the joint and several notices as well.
Yeah, there's this as well. And this kind of leads on from what we were talking about earlier with regards to Kittel. So again, you know, your company may fail because you've had fraud in your supply chain, and HMRC said you should have known, and they've managed to uphold that view. So they've dragged back all of the input VAT, and they've hit the company with an eye-watering penalty that it can't pay. They will come after the directors. So there's that side of it. But equally, where there is a company that enters into liquidation with large amounts of VAT and or pay-as-you-earn outstanding, then if HMRC consider that deliberate behaviour of a responsible person within that business, usually but not always a director, has resulted in that potential loss of revenue, then they can now come after that person individually, and indeed do so. It's a relatively high bar for them to get across, of course, because you know, deliberate behaviour, an accusation of deliberate behaviour is an accusation of fraud. And you know, HMRC, particularly around penalties, are very quick to throw out accusations of deliberate behaviour. Of course they are, but to be able to prove it, and the onus is on them, they've got to be able to evidence intent on the part of the individual. But notwithstanding, it's all part of a general assault on the directors of businesses that cease to trade or cease to exist, owing a lot of money to HMRC. It's no longer the case that you can, you know, liquidate away from tax debts. They are coming after you personally, right, in more and more cases.
So the limited protection is just not there?
Not in the sense that it used to be, absolutely not, no.
Right. Okay. So thank you very much for that. So I've got a question here that's come through about the non-repayment of bounce back loan implications. We talked about this before we came in.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of companies got into insolvency at the moment who took bounce back loans during the COVID period. The insolvency practitioner will have a legal requirement to ascertain the use of those loans within the business. And if, for instance, the insolvency practitioner finds 2 brand new Porsches parked outside the front door that were paid for in cash, then there's a reasonable argument that the business couldn't afford them and the bounce back loans were not used for the appropriate reason. And again, there is then potential criminal charges behind that piece that the insolvency practitioner would have to report and deal with.
Okay. So there's a couple of questions that I'd like to go back to because Bopinder, who was trying to post a question earlier, this does take us back a little. I'm dealing with a contract disclosure facility with my client. Limited company and director will have liability. It's looking more likely that the company and director will not be able to afford payment and enter into a meaningful arrangement. I have not made the inspector aware as yet. Any idea how this may end? There you go. There's a challenge for you. Predict the future for Bopinder, please.
I actually know Bob. Hi, Bob. Good to virtually catch up with you today. Crikey. So I actually would be having the conversation with HMRC early on and looking at, if not a CVA, then probably talking to the client about, insolvency proceedings of some sort. You're making the disclosure. I'm guessing this is a disclosure in respect of a company.
Yeah, I think that's what she said,
fine.
wasn't it?
Bops, there you go.
Company and director.
Yeah, company and director, limited company and director will have liability.
Yeah. It's going to be a very difficult one, this actually. So if they're going to have liability separately, so I'm guessing, I suppose I'm trying to understand how the director will have liability. So if you could share a little bit of that. Are you saying that the company is likely to liquidate and HMRC will seek to exercise their joint and several powers, or indeed, they're if it's something under Kittel or similar? So the company will have to liquidate at such point as the liability crystallises on it if it simply can't pay it. What I would be doing is I would be placing all of my energy into trying to establish that the director hasn't been guilty of deliberate behaviour, but rather his behaviour was careless.
I think we should probably, we can address this one separately because otherwise we'll do a full CSI on TaxCount TV. It'd be quite good. But I do have another one, and this is, I don't know if this will take us down the same route, but very briefly because I'm conscious of time. But Kelly asked, if a company has suffered a fraud via an employee, CIS, PAYE paid into employee's personal account rather than HMRC, an employee found guilty of fraud in position of responsibility, can the employee be held responsible for the HMRC debt?
Yes.
Yes.
Done.
Effectively,
where an employee has colluded in a pay-as-you-earn fraud, or indeed, from the sounds of it, in this case, committed it, yes, absolutely, HMRC can and do go after the employee, although sometimes we have to guide HMRC down that path. But yeah, very much, absolutely. And I would say that's just natural justice.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Paul, you were promising everyone earlier for a little bit of insight, a few minutes if you can, on what is driving the nudge letters, the tech behind HMRC's Connect system. Can you just describe that for everyone? What are they capable of, and what does it allow them to do that you might not expect?
I suppose Connect is the revenue's biggest single successful investment ever.
Did you say only?
Well, yes, possibly. Listen, they invested a huge chunk of money with British Aerospace to design and develop Connect. It grows exponentially on a daily basis. It now holds reputedly north of 80 billion lines of data. Can you imagine? All in one central silo. And it's learning It's intelligent. It's part of the growing AI world that we live in. So the reports that it can generate and the data it can release is becoming easier and simpler to do. So in a perfect world, the revenue's perfect world, it asks Connect to generate a report of landlords in a certain catchment area, postcode area. Connect generates that report. Another piece of AI then issues a load of template letters to taxpayers, or sorry, should I say customers, and says to them, you might want to consider your 2023 return with potential information that suggests it's incorrect.
And this is genuinely without human intervention.
Yeah.
This is just...
Yeah, it's just automated processes. Doesn't need any human hands on it at all. And the ideal end to this for the revenue is that the taxpayer will go to the accountant and say, hey, look, I've had this letter. You know what? Yes, I should have told you about the property I've had for the last 5 years. Accountant's going to say, okay, we need to knock up some accounts, we need to submit amended returns, repair these returns, and we need to make a payment on account or payment of the liability that's arisen and the interest due. Your wonderful tax software will do most of that work for the accountant. They'll just go in, make the amendments. The system will generate the additional liability. Taxpayer will pay it. And you know what? Revenue have got a result and it's cost them nothing, only a stamp. And it's as simple and as easy as that. And if they genuinely believe that taxpayer has got the return incorrect and they don't receive a response, then they'll go down the formal route and issue a 9A or a 12A notice.
And that's when an individual gets involved.
That's when an individual gets involved. But that's why the questions earlier, and that's why me and Nick were really surprised at that response, that, there was a high percentage where there wasn't a need to amend return. Yeah. And if that's the case, then the revenue's design plan on this is not going to achieve potentially what they think it is.
Yeah, it's the algorithm as well that they might be using. But I guess the chances are they're going to improve that, if anything. So
the data they're getting is growing all the time, and the sources are growing. So whether that is from card reader providers, whether that is from other government agencies, whether that is just giving information requests to BUPA, estate agents, anybody where they know they're sitting and holding third-party information about taxpayers, they're going to pursue it and use it. And that's the world we live in. And we mentioned NI numbers earlier, and I think I probably mentioned this last time, and I'll say it again. Any government form you tend to complete these days asks for your national insurance number. And it's just
a reason for that.
Linking it all
That's
into
where it's all going.
Yeah. And increasingly, of course, they're receiving information from overseas jurisdictions as well.
The Pandoras and
information sharing has become very much a thing.
Right.
So they're overwhelmed with information. So it's how do they make best use of that information? Now, nudge campaigns, these were driven by what used to be a government unit, which David Cameron became very interested in when he was Prime Minister. And it's all about using psychology to change people's behaviours and giving out messages to do that. That unit's now been privatised, but HMRC are still a huge user of it, predominantly through nudge letters, because it's the most effective and efficient use of this vast pool of information they've now got.
So, scared or not, it's all happening. Okay, so the next bit, this is the bit you've all been waiting for. Yes, we're going to be talking about R&D. I've done one more poll for you. Now, if I can pull off a hat trick and make 3 polls live relatively successfully, I will go away very happy. So the question we wanted to ask is around if one of your clients has been subject to an R&D inquiry, what has been the outcome? So I'm going to attempt to make that live now. It could well be there. So that should be live. So did they withdraw their claim? Did they continue to pursue the claim, but then not make any subsequent claims? Did they continue to pursue and then make subsequent claims? Or have you just not had any R&D claims? So I'd be interested to know what your views are. Now it looks like we've got 88%. This is 120 votes so far. Right, very high up, very few R&D inquiries. None of those have had an R&D inquiry. The next one is only 10% have continued to pursue that inquiry and have made subsequent claims. So it hasn't put them off, which is, I guess,
that's good.
Kind of good news.
Yeah, I think obviously the revenue had a justifiable need to put some enforcement around the R&D market. It was running riot. I don't think many professionals would disagree with the need for that. I think most professionals would disagree with the way in which they went about doing it, because it was very remote. It was very template letter led. There was no real training or engagement from the revenue about how this inquiry process should work. From my personal experience, we've seen through claims that we've handled that a lot of taxpayers, especially on small claims, and by that I would mean R&D relief of around about £3,000 to £5,000 per se, have actually walked away from the claim.
Right.
They've not wanted to pursue it. They decided actually it's not worth the actual potential professional costs of doing that, and have walked away from it. And I think there's a bit of revenue hope here that just by this activity alone, the number of R&D claims being made will slow and stop.
Right.
Only potentially genuine claims will now be made moving forward.
It's the deterrent.
I think there's been a bit of deterrent about that, and I think that's why they took the heavy-handed approach they did, because it actually just shook the market and scared a lot of people.
But they're still taking a fairly heavy-handed approach, or has that shifted at all?
There's a bit more engagement now. Depending which unit you're dealing with, you get a bit more engagement now. It's not great, but they are learning and they are listening. And some of the staff that have been involved in this from day one now are a lot further down that journey in understanding how these claims need to be handled. Still massive delays, still lots of template letters with no real reason behind them. So will it have been successful? I think the answer will be yes, it will. And what we are now seeing is, which is surprising because it hasn't really happened until recently, the revenue now are starting, where they've been successful in challenging a year, they're now starting to go back and look at the other in-date years. Right. And that is only just starting to happen.
This is the prior claims that we were discussing. Yeah. So that would be interesting. It would be interesting to know how far they can go back, etc. How far can they go back? What?
They've got the 4 years in date years.
4 years in date.
Yeah.
But if they discover something else, they can go back further.
They could technically do a discovery assessment, but would they, Nick? It's more your area than mine. That.
I think they might well, because what I think they'll do is invoke the continuity.
The projects have been going through.
The principle of continuity. So, if a company's been routinely submitting annual R&D claims, and particularly if they're in respect of a long-standing continuing project, and HMRC managed to knock over the recent one, then I think what will dictate how far back they can go, as always, will be down to the taxpayer behaviours. So the standard is 4 years, but if they're careless, it's 6 years. And what we need to be careful of, because we are seeing this, if they are making an accusation that people have deliberately made fraudulent R&D claims, then the gloves are off. They can go back. The R&D relief didn't exist 20 years ago, but they can go back. I don't like the way they're handling the inquiries. I think that the way that they're handling them actually contravenes the taxpayers' charter, which tells them that they need to be using suitably qualified and experienced personnel to undertake investigations and inquiries, and certainly with regards to R&D, they're not. I also don't like the fact that they're very often refusing to settle cases, even in the face of clear evidence that's been provided. So too much is having to go down the tribunal route. And I think there's going to be a cluster of tribunal cases that will be coming up. We've not had one go to tribunal yet, but that's quite simply because generally these days when we list something into tribunal, it's with a view to taking it into ADR, alternative dispute resolution. And the big benefit of that in an R&D inquiry is that once you get to the ADR meeting, HMRC will have properly qualified technical people who will assist the caseworker within the ADR. So we're finding that because we're failing to get proper traction with the caseworker, and we think that's usually because they've not been properly trained on what they're doing. There's that recurring thing.
But is that in the specialism that the R&D is in, so they don't know about bread or software?
Well, at the end of the day, I mean, you can be a very good tax professional, and, you know, working in the revenue, but you know, does that person have the skill set to know that that line of code and a bit of software is what actually makes it R&D?
Yeah.
No. Yeah. So you've got to understand the bigger picture. And at the moment, the revenue haven't been engaging with the accountant and the company to actually understand that piece. It's just been, no, it's not. No. And it's like, well, we need to talk. And that communication channel just hasn't been there. No.
Yeah, because they're not willing to engage.
Yeah.
The other point that Paul brings up, I think it was Paul, no, it was Matthew, sorry, the R&D disclosure facility will prove popular. This is, I presume, the pre-disclosures? It's not the upcoming, that was there.
He said the pre-notification. Does he mean the pre-notification?
The upcoming R&D disclosure facility will prove popular. What's the need when we already have the DDS?
I'm not entirely sure.
I'm not entirely sure.
Matthew, we might need some clarification.
I haven't heard anything about a specific disclosure facility on R&D.
I do think the pre-notification process will be and is already being good, because I think that is having the result of weeding out a lot of claims that in the past probably would have been made but shouldn't have been made.
Right.
So, you know, it's looking better for the future of it.
To allow them to focus on...
Well, the thing that it does is the pre-notification form, one of the first questions it asks is who the project manager is. And then can we have the contact details?
Right.
So actually, the revenue will speak directly to the person who's doing the job and can answer the questions they need to ask. An accountant isn't in a place to do that.
No.
So there's no point talking to an accountant in truth about it, not cut them out, but actually, you know, it's not the relevant party to have that conversation with.
Although I would say, to me, what's critical to the successful outcome of an R&D inquiry from our point of view is for somebody to be acting as translator. Yeah. Because very often the issue we've got is that the competent professional will be entirely satisfied of the R&D that they have produced or are producing, but find it difficult to explain it in a language that HMRC can actually understand. So really, we almost see our role when, you know, we're entirely satisfied that there is legitimate R&D, is translating, it's getting out of the competent professional's head in a layperson's language, something that firstly we can understand, because we're certainly not experts in you know, the intricacies of you know, technical R&D, but if we can understand it, then we've got a reasonable chance of helping an HMRC caseworker to understand it. So I do think the accountant has a role, which is that of translator.
I think what we're finding is, and we've seen this in a vast number of claims we've handled that have come through our claims team, when we have the report reviewed, what we're being told on lots of occasions is there is R&D potentially here, but that report will never achieve the claim.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the report is badly written. It's 30 pages of irrelevance in a lot of cases, because it doesn't matter how long the report is. There may well be R&D, but that report will never
If it doesn't touch
substantiate
the
it.
right.
Yeah.
So you think overall the message is that perhaps the R&D landscape has become a little bit less Wild West, a little bit more mature now?
It's heading that way.
Heading that way. That's good news, positive, I hope. I am conscious of time. We've got a few minutes left, and there was an important thing I know you wanted to talk about, Nick, but one quick question. Has there been an increase in inquiries about sideways loss relief claims, especially since the 50k cap was introduced?
I've not seen it. That might be one for Paul.
We've seen some, not many, but this is part for me of a bigger piece of the revenue will constantly challenge relief claims. Historically, it was never an area that got great attention, but there might not be no new taxes, but the revenue seem to be prepared to say that they are willing to challenge interpretation of relief claims in a way they have never done before.
Okay, right. Thank you for that. Kelly, well, I'll come back to you on that question shortly. Kelly's after, she wants some advice on which HMRC department she would contact around that fraudulent employee earlier.
Okay, good luck. Good luck with that one. Yeah, I'm not sure which one.
Cross your fingers, I think, is the answer to that, Kelly. Okay, so Nick, you were talking when we spoke earlier on the phone about a project that you're involved with, and I think it's got some very important implications. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
How long have I got?
You've got precisely 1.5 minutes. No, you've got around a couple of minutes, if you can quickly.
A couple of minutes, okay. This is a big old subject. It's a very important subject. This is about taxpayer suicide, which obviously is very emotive, but particularly suicide of taxpayers who are under the more serious HMRC investigations. So I'm talking about criminal investigations and Code of Practice 9 investigations. As a member of the contentious tax group nationally, we're actually doing work at the moment to seek to uncover the extent of this and to closely and critically examine the degree of safeguarding that HMRC undertake when a taxpayer under investigation is flagged as being very vulnerable and with severe mental health conditions. So at the moment, everything that we have is largely anecdotal, but what that anecdotal evidence tells us is there is a real issue. We're not surprised, given that when HMRC open a criminal investigation, it can very often be 4 or 5 years before they take a decision on whether or not to bring charges. Now, I don't think it matters whether the taxpayer is guilty or innocent, but let's not forget a lot of them are innocent. Irrespective, they do have families, they have loved ones, and that's an awful long time to be held in purgatory, whilst HMRC do their investigation and take their decision on whether or not that person's potentially going to lose their liberty, probably along with everything else. So it's something that we've certainly flagged up as an issue as nationally the contentious tax group. We're making various freedom of information requests. HMRC are knocking all of those back, telling us they do hold the data we're after, but it would be too expensive for them to provide it to us. We will keep on, but we're continuing to gather evidence of the sheer amount of taxpayer suicide that is sadly taking place. And by taxpayer suicide, I mean when the balance of somebody's mind has been tipped in that direction by the manner of the activity they're facing from HMRC and the lack of safeguarding. So if anybody does have anything anecdotal that they'd be happy to talk to us about, please do, because we're gathering evidence with a view to raising this with HMRC and having a dialogue with them about how better the serious investigations could be handled in many cases.
So how can people get in touch with you? What's the best?
You can go through the NHD Tax Solutions Limited website and email through that.
Well, we'll be sending out a copy of this webinar to everyone afterwards, as we always do, and we'll put your contact details on there.
That'd be lovely.
If anyone does have that. It's horrible to listen to, horrible to hear, but important work. So thanks for that. Okay, so we've come to the end of the time. I do have one quick update. Matthew Watkins, the question about the R&D, the disclosures. He said there was an announcement last week that a dedicated R&D disclosure facility will go live by the end of June, announced through the CIOT. Personally, he doesn't think it'll be popular. But I'm not familiar with that at all. I don't know.
Disclosure facilities are great, but the problem with them is not a problem. But anybody who's going through a disclosure process needs to be fully aware that that disclosure doesn't just relate to one specific tax. It relates to all tax across every area. And if the revenue come back and prove that disclosure wasn't full, then you're in a serious position and problem.
Right.
So I wouldn't say never use one, but if you're using one, you've got to be complete about.
So you have
the taxpayers
similar doubts about its success.
I agree. I mean, that one had passed me by actually. So thanks very much for that, Matthew. I would say that if somebody's made an inappropriate R&D claim, it's odds on that HMRC are going to have picked it up anyway. Given the sheer number of R&D inquiries that are out there. But yeah, I'd think long and hard before using that particular facility.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, gents. Really appreciate you coming in. I've got some comments here in the chat, which I'll point you to later. People wanted to contact you and happy to discuss around the suicide prevention work that you're doing. Right. Thank you all very, very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed that. Hope it was useful. I found it fascinating. I learned a lot about how to put polls live too, which is quite good for me. So our next outing will be at Accountex next week. I hope you'll be there. If you are there, please do come by, come and see the stand, come say hi. We've got some extra swag this year, which we're very proud of. You'll be pleased to know. So do come by. And the next thing we've got coming up is going to be on June the 12th for TaxCalc TV. Very special session. We've got Craig Ogilvie, who's leading the MTD outing for HMRC, and Rebecca Bennyworth will be joining us too. So we're going to be making MTD fashionable again, if that's at all possible. So we're going to have lots and lots of questions, I'm suspecting, from you guys. The emails will be coming out very, very shortly. Please subscribe to that. It's going to be a fantastic session. That is on June the 12th, 2 p.m, right here in the TaxCalc studio. So thank you very much once again, gents. Really appreciate you coming in. Thanks for joining us today. Take care.